Thank you.
Right. Yeah, so I have been at Sandia for just shy of 5 years. I'm in a discrete math and optimization department, which doesn't at all really describe what I do. But Sandia is a big place, and it seems like for a lot of folks, their official home does not describe the work that they do. But anyway, happy to be here. And lately, I've been doing a lot of work and a lot of thinking about how you model threats and impacts when you are doing resilience analysis. So this is basically going to be a bit of a winding presentation about different things that I think are important to consider, different ways of approaching this problem, and some examples of some ongoing work that fall under a couple of my projects right now. So I will start by introducing you to how I first got into resilience analysis. So a lot of my work in graduate school was more focused on renewable energy integration and uncertainty modeling. So obviously, that can be related to resilience depending on how you think about it, but it's much more a question of sort of reliability and improving the efficiency of our power systems in terms of making better use of renewable sources. Towards the end of my PhD, I ended up doing a large project that was looking at the impact of power systems from hurricanes. So some folks in my group and I had collaborated on building an outage prediction model for basically predicting the fraction of customers expected to lose power from a hurricane impacting the US. So picture up in the top left is just an example of what those forecasts look like. And there's plenty of uncertainty here. The model has strengths and weaknesses. And it's a purely statistical data-driven model, right? So there are no fragility curves, no physical modeling of poles falling or lines falling or anything like that. It's purely a statistical model. So I moved from that to using that same model to model the long-term impacts of hurricanes and climate change scenarios. So basically, if you can predict the impact of the power system from one hurricane, then you can predict the impact of power systems from 100 years worth of hurricanes, for example. And if you start looking out 100 years, then hurricanes are projected to start behaving quite differently. So there's a lot of research showing that there'll be changes in both frequency and intensity of storms, and possibly also the landfall location. If oceans warm, storms might start to shift further north, but there's, again, uncertainty in this space, as you can imagine, with all things climate related. And so I, was looking at resilience from sort of a sensitivity analysis perspective. And this is just a sample of the results in the bottom, showing differences between a baseline case with our current climate. And then if we run a scenario where hurricanes increase in intensity by a significant margin, and you can see that the average, the expected 100-year wind speed varies quite a bit depending on where you are in the country. DC is fairly inland, and hurricanes start to dissipate as soon as they hit landfall because you have so much surface friction that weakens them. So not huge impacts in DC, but you can see Miami, New York see these quite sizable increases in expected wind speeds, and therefore the expected damage, which I'm not showing here. So anyway, my work in resilience has evolved quite a bit since then, and I'm now thinking about a much wider range of threats. So if you are trying to think about a region of the country and all of the threats that they might be exposed to, or if you want to take the country as a whole, which I'm currently trying to do with the NARM project, the North America Energy Resilience Project, we are trying to think about all of the threats that different parts of the countries care about. So you start to see some really complex and varied impacts to infrastructure. And I know this is a power system focused group, but this work is trying to apply these impact models to all of the infrastructure that we might care about, including trying to capture the interdependencies if there are impacts to gas that impact electric or electric that impact gas, for example. But basically the point here is that, if you are trying to model the impacts, the operational decisions, and the response to an ice storm in the Northeast, that's going to look very different from the same type of model that you would create for a long-term drought in the Southwest. So That being said, I'm going to now go stand on my soapbox and talk a little bit about the difference between reliability analysis and resilience analysis. This is very much my opinion, so take it with a grain of salt. But I typically see folks treat resilience analysis as just a very simple extension to reliability analysis. And in large part, you need the same tools, right? So you need some sort of a system to test your models on. Whether you're doing optimization or simulation, you need to set that up. You need failures, right? So if nothing goes wrong, you don't care, you're both reliable and resilient. And you also need to calculate the consequences. So the real difference that I've seen most folks apply is that reliability analysis is looking at n-1 failures, right? So a single generator trips offline, can your system handle that? And you maybe do some random scenarios of all of these n-1 conditions and make sure you're okay. Resilience analysis is typically focused on higher consequence events. And so it makes sense that instead of n-1, you might say, okay, like let's just do n-k, and we will randomly sample that k, and maybe k equals 5 or 10 or 20, depending on the size of your system. But hopefully it's representative of the type of impacts from threats that you're concerned about. I'd like to argue that this choice of k and how you model this k matters quite a bit. So a lot of events that impact resilience are truly multi-sector. So you're not just taking out you're not just taking out a handful of components in the electric grid. You might also rupture a gas pipeline and lose gas supply and need to model that. You might have impacts to water that might impact your ability to cool your thermal generators, right? So these the things that you need to pay attention to and care about span sectors. If there are interdependencies, and you need to capture those. Also, so as I said, resilience events are typically high consequence, and they're not necessarily high consequence just because a lot of things fail. It's often because those things that fail are spatially concentrated, right? So if you think of an earthquake, all of the things that fail are in a very small spatial region. It's not that you have 10 components that failed across the entire country. And it's really important to try to capture that, as that often drives the severity of the impact. There's also, these failures are not always concurrent, which is often the easiest way to model something. You're like, an event happens, we lose 5 components at t equals 1, and we go from there. A lot of events unfold over time, and a good example of that is actually a hurricane. It might make landfall on the Gulf Coast and then slowly snake its way across the coast or up through the mainland. And therefore you have impacts to your infrastructure that are unfolding over hours to days, and that needs to be accounted for as well if you're trying to truly model the impacts of these events. Lastly, and this applies if you are trying to get into the space of restoration or recovery modeling. So the cause of the failure and the type of the failure matters quite a bit. If something is physically damaged, then it needs to be repaired or replaced. And that's very different from if something trips offline and just simply needs a switch to be flipped or something to be re-energized, for example. So this is more looking at the after event impacts and how you model the recovery of the system, but this can matter quite a bit depending on the questions that you're trying to answer. Okay, so I'll get off my soapbox about resilience analysis, but we'll show you a quick example of sort of what I mean by this. So if you're an analyst and you want to assess the impact of a threat, maybe your boss asked what might happen if we lose 3 buses and 2 branches in our system. In the first case on the left, you might approach this from a pretty standard point of view, where you randomly sample and you can build up a distribution of what that impact looks like. So you can get some mean expected value, you can get a worst case, you can get a 90% tail, right? Like you can start to give your boss an answer, but like, oh yeah, like this is the range of impacts if we lose 3 buses and 2 branches. On the second case, I would argue that, okay, turns out your boss cares about earthquakes, right? So your system maybe sits on a fault line and you know that earthquakes will happen eventually, whether it's next week or next year or in 10 years, but you do want to know whether your system is resilient to earthquakes specifically. These no longer can be modeled randomly, right? So we know something about earthquakes. They have an epicenter and ground motion that sort of is highly concentrated at the epicenter and dissipates the further away you get. So in this case, you really want to account for spatial correlations in these component failures. So instead of random scenarios of failures, instead, maybe you have random scenarios of the epicenter location, but then spatially correlated failures that surround that. And there's a really simple diagram of what that could look like with a little orange explosion and the resulting failures in red. Okay, so getting a little bit more realistic and continuing with this earthquake example, this is some work that I'm doing for that NARM project that I mentioned earlier. So this is, really trying to build up some threat modeling capabilities for our infrastructure. Earthquakes are, I have this in italics, a relatively simple threat to model. There's still tons of nuances, but basically, at the end of the day, the ground shakes and things break as a result. And so the inputs that are required to model the impacts of an earthquake are basically ground motion data, some notion of how sensitive things are to that ground motion. And so this typically comes in the form of hazard curves or fragility curves. And these can be obtained from experimentation. There's a lot of stuff in the literature. HAZUS has a huge database of these hazard curves. And then a knowledge of your component location. So if you know where all of your components are, you can map them to the ground motion at that location, map it to the appropriate fragility curve, and give yourself a probability of failure. So what I'm showing on the right, the fragility of components matters quite a bit depending on what it is. If you're a large generator that is anchored and built for seismic motion, then you're much less likely to fail than something that might be a bit not designed to those same standards, or maybe a pipeline is a lot more likely to fail than a generator. So you need to sort of know the component types, know which fragility curves to apply, but then you can start to create very realistic scenarios of what could go wrong should an earthquake occur in a given location. Okay, so I've done some work there. As I said, earthquakes, relatively simple. Other threats are quite a bit more complicated. And this is something that I spend a lot of time driving home to other folks who are trying to model the threats. And it's really just about considering the second and sometimes third, but usually we can stop at second order impacts from a threat itself. So in many cases, the first order impact would be component damage, right? A threat occurs, you have high winds or flooding or ground shaking, and that damages components of your system. This is generally pretty obvious, and most people are good at capturing this type of impact. But there are other things to consider. So changing resource availability is a big one. And a few examples of this, so you guys are in California, if a wildfire brings heavy smoke to a region, you suddenly don't have the same PV resource that you had expected, right? So the sun's still there, it's shining, but you have this thick layer of smoke and you're not getting the same production that you would have wanted. Another example is if a storm brings really strong winds to a region, they might exceed the cutoff wind speed for your wind turbines, and perhaps you lose all of your wind generation as that storm rolls through. So these are sort of second order, I would argue, second order impacts that need to be accounted for because they really do dictate how the system is operating through this event. Another thing to consider is changing demand. Some really, a really obvious example is during a heat wave, everyone's ramping up their air conditioning, and thus your demand will go through the roof. You'll have like a peak summer day. Other things to consider is, if you have a hurricane or a wildfire that has evacuation orders, if people follow them and all of the people leave a region, then all of a sudden you have no demand, and it's important to account for that in your load forecasts. There are also cross-sector interdependencies, and I sort of mentioned these a little bit earlier. And we saw some really severe examples of this. I don't know if any of you paid attention to the polar vortex that occurred in early 2019 in the Midwest. So we had extreme cold temperatures, And this resulted in increased demand for gas for home heating. So a lot of homes have natural gas heat. Gas demand went up. Most natural gas generators did not actually have firm contracts. So they had flexible contracts, and if the supply wasn't there, then they simply didn't get it. So this led to some real shortages in terms of, you have increased load, increased demand on the electricity system, and decreased supply because your gas generators don't have gas because it's all going to home heating. So these are some important things to try to capture as well if you can get the data and get the information to do so. There are also, some threats are much long term. Droughts unfold over months to years, as you also know in California. Man, you guys just have a lot of threats out there. So if you have a long-term drought, then suddenly you are accounting for really long-term constraints on your hydro, right? So you need to be tracking hydro production over seasons and years, as opposed to, over the course of a day or a week. Additionally, this can reduce the water available for cooling. And so maybe the Pmax of your thermal generators decreases by 10 or 20%, right? So these are things that also need to be accounted for that are easily overlooked second order impacts. Yeah, I'll also argue, and this is something that we are just starting to think about in the realm of wildfires, human decisions, right? So the decision element is huge, whether a utility chooses to de-energize lines in a region. It's hard to model that, right? Like it's hard to, some utilities have rule sets and you can try to follow those and capture what would actually be done if fire risk got high enough. But it's hard, right? Like this is one of those things that there's no physical model for how a human will behave. So yeah, there are certain complexities when you start to get into the operational decision making. I will note down at the bottom in green here, so most of what I'm talking about, I guess all of what I'm talking about really focuses on transmission level impacts. And this is a bias that I have because most of the projects that I'm working on are looking at a bit of a higher level view, focusing on the transmission level infrastructure, either gas or the power grid. The impacts to actual humans, right? Like actual people, actual communities, are much more so on the distribution side. And as I'm sure you all know, this gets extremely difficult to try to capture whether the people are truly okay based on what's happening, since the distribution system requires a lot more detail to model. Okay, so that's basically just a plug to really try to capture the complexities of threats if you are modeling resilience. Okay, so walking through a couple examples of how we've tried to do this in various projects. I mentioned the polar vortex of HAPN 19. We basically tried to mimic this event without having all of the perfect data. There's a lot that you can gain from reading like the after event situation reports and trying to make sure you're capturing the same like order of magnitude of impacts, even if you don't know the exact generator impacts or bus impacts. But there are a lot of things that can go wrong with extreme cold temperatures, it turns out. So I already mentioned failure in natural gas supply or delivery. There are also really high forced outage rates across all of your thermal generators if things get really cold. And so I did a lot of reading about why this is. If there's any moisture in a sensor line or in a valve, that will often freeze and cause the generator to shut down. In one case, I also read a report about coal piles that froze and therefore couldn't feed in through the feed system to the generator. So all kinds of things can go wrong once you are hitting like minus 40 degree temperatures. There's also spatiotemporal dependencies. So you see this map here on the right. The Midwest was extremely cold, like extremely cold. But at the same time, many parts of the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic were well below average for those regions. So not only will your demand be incredibly high for both gas and electricity in the Midwest, But these other parts of the country are also going to have higher demand as well, because like I'm used to 60 degrees and all of a sudden it's 40, and so I want to crank my heat. So you have to account for the fact that, in this case, basically the entire eastern part of the country had some, correlations in their demanding increases. Let's see. So there are some mitigation strategies, and these are some of the things that we tried to model. And this is maybe getting ahead of myself, but there are some. When I left a note in here that does not belong. Sorry, I grabbed the slide from another talk. So we tried to model the impacts of some mitigation strategies when doing this. There are dual fuel capable natural gas generators. And what this looks like is that you'll have a gas generator that has a giant tank out back with oil in it. So maybe they have the ability to burn oil for, 3 days or 10 days or something like that. And if they lose gas supply, then they'll just switch over to their auxiliary fuel. So we modeled some impacts of increased dual fuel penetration levels. If you were to invest in more dual fuel generators in a region, would you better be able to withstand an extreme cold weather event? Also looked at the impact of cold weather packages on wind turbines. So this is one thing that I learned fairly recently, but wind turbines have a hard temperature cutoff. So they're the components in the nacelle just can't operate safely if it gets extremely cold. A lot of this is the hydraulic lubricants, but they sell extra cold weather packages that basically just provide little heaters in the nacelle, which allow you to operate down to a slightly colder temperature. There's still a cutoff, but it's much lower. So we experimented with some of these, these modeling considerations, and this is an example of the type of simulations that you can do when trying to model these impacts. So at the top left, I'm showing an example of thermal outages. So coal outages are due to increased forced outage rate, as I mentioned, various things freeze and generators are forced offline. The gas outages are a combination of lack of supply and the higher forced outage rates if they do have supply. So basically, this is trying to model just the MISO region, and they lost an extremely large amount of their thermal generators. I think it ended up being about 28 or 29% of their thermal capacity was forced offline during the peak of the polar vortex event, which is quite significant. So we can model these outages and model how the system behaves as things are forced offline over time. What I'm showing here on the right-hand side is a profile of simulated wind power generation. And so you can compare it to the solid line, which is our model of what would happen if there's no polar vortex and therefore no low temperature cutoffs in the wind power. And then we also had different scenarios, and I'm only showing two here, but different scenarios of the penetration level of cold weather packages. So basically, what percentage of wind turbines in your fleet have a cold weather package allowing you to operate down to, I believe it is -30°C as opposed to -10°C. So as you can see, there is benefit to paying for these cold weather packages, and you can show this in a modeling context. You can also look at sensitivities, right? So as I said, we didn't have exact data for these thermal outages. We just knew a rough order of magnitude what had been forced offline based on fuel type and the day of the event. And we can do some sensitivity analysis as shown here. So in this case, we have applied a model that links temperature to failure for the thermal fleets. And so you have different models for your coal, for your gas, et cetera. And we can just play out some different scenarios of randomly sampling which ones are forced offline. And so this is showing, I think, 10 realizations from one prioritization of the model, but basically we've done some really large scale sensitivity analysis on what actually matters and how your system is able to operate through these uncertain conditions when it comes to generator failures. Okay, one short story that follows on that off of that wind example I just showed you. So this is again looking at that same thing where you have wind power with these low temperature cutoffs. if you don't have cold weather packages, we basically just did a quick study of how much you're actually losing in terms of production. So I think the maximum single hour loss is somewhere right around here on January 30th. And that max loss was 38 gigawatts in the system. So this is notional data, but if you look at the actual MISO data from this event, they lost half of their wind production. And the scary thing is it was not forecasted, right? So they pay for wind power forecasts, and apparently, I assume it has changed since then, but apparently those forecasts, or the forecast vendor, did not take temperature into account at all, which typically doesn't matter, right? Like it's rare to get temperatures that are this low. But yeah, so they were predicting, forget what, but they ended up getting 50% of their predicted wind power during that event. Just to show what the difference is, if you do apply these cold weather packages, we did a quick study of what those savings would look like. And for this notional data set, it ended up being 2,000 gigawatt hours over this 8-day stretch, right? So things eventually warm up over here on like February 2nd. But during this time period, you can save 2,000 gigawatt hours by having cold weather packages on all of your turbines. Of course, this requires that you have quite cold temperatures to make up the cost of installing these things, but it's quite significant. Okay, so trying to keep an eye on the time here. What do we use these threat scenarios for? You guys all came to a talk about resilience, so truly this is for studies of resilience, right? So you can create scenarios, plug them into whatever model you're using, start to assess how resilient you are to certain event types, compare upgrade investments, do some cost benefit trade-offs. If you have information on the cost of things, you can assess worst case impacts. But these all require some pretty high fidelity models of what can actually go wrong in these systems. And I would argue that these threat models are the key input, right? So it's the key differentiator when it comes to moving from something like reliability analysis to true resilience analysis. And random failures just don't suffice if you are concerned with a specific threat type. There are complex data challenges, as you can imagine. A lot of this data is not easily available, but I do think it's important to try to at least capture the nature of the impacts if possible, and understand that there are huge uncertainties, and you can try to model those uncertainties as well. So again, this is showing a one single example from that sensitivity analysis study that I showed earlier, looking at, okay, so you can take those thermal failures that I showed before and actually run them through. In this case, we are using Prescient, which is a production cost model. If you apply those thermal failures, and you can start to look at quantities that you might actually care about when it comes to resilience. In this case, I'm just showing cost and load shed compared to the baseline case. So yeah, the results aren't that important here, but you can obviously see that there are some real changes in load shed if you start to take generators offline, which is expected. And you can use this to try to then model investments and maybe some operational decisions that could reduce impacts. Okay, so that is pretty much all I have. I guess some ongoing work. As I mentioned, I've got basically 2 projects that are currently looking at threat modeling in various forms. So we are trying to look at new threat types, wildfire specifically, looking at operational decisions and how utilities behave when it comes to wildfire threats. Drought is a challenge because you have an extremely long time horizon. Instead of going from hours to days, you're suddenly going from days to months to years. So a lot of research to do there. Never-ending challenge to find good data. Even being at a national lab, you think we'd have great access to NDAs with utility companies or some of the federal, like NERC data, for example. It's a challenge. It's just always a headache. So, the fidelity of these models is highly dependent on the fidelity of the data that you have to populate them. Yeah, and I guess for one of my projects, we are moving into the space of decision making when it comes to these threats. So if you can create high quality scenarios that represent the range of uncertain impacts from a threat, then you can start to look at how stochastic optimization might perform to improve your decisions in the face of these. So we are starting to do that with some temperature scenarios, looking at both the operator being able to respond to uncertain forecasts for wind outages and for thermal failures. If you know that some things in your system will go out, but you don't know exactly what, can you improve your decisions to reduce those impacts? So that's currently what's going on in my life, and that's all I've got. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Andrea. That was really interesting. I have about, applause. I have about half a dozen questions myself, but I'm going to hold back a little bit and turn it over to the students for asking questions. The first one in the chat window is from Gabrielle. And I'd like to encourage all of you to maybe submit questions in the chat window so we can take them one at a time. Gabriel, do you want to go ahead and ask yours?
Sure. Excuse me. Hi, Andrea. Thanks for the talk. I was wondering what kind of recommendations do you provide to governments/utilities based on the kind of results that you generate from the analysis?
Yeah, great question. Most of my work is actually in the research space, so it doesn't quite get to operational decision making, although that the NARM project that I mentioned is getting close. So this is a huge multi-lab project funded by DOE to build up this resilience modeling capability. So we are basically just trying to provide high fidelity models that that give an analyst, right, give a user or give an analyst a sense of what the impact would be. The customer is DOE, and they don't actually have decision-making power when it comes to our infrastructure. As you can imagine, right, they're not a utility company, they're not a gas utility company. And so they just want to know, and I think they also really want this information to be able to consider the national security impacts if you have critical military bases or facilities that might be impacted. That's the kind of information that the government really cares about. I think other things are typically left to the utilities themselves.
Thanks.
I have a follow-up question on that. If Sasha, if you'll let me jump in line. I'm not sure what the line is.
No, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Andrea. I'm Anna Brockway, a PhD student. Thank you so much for your talk. This was super interesting. I've actually been involved in a project considering like what would it take to adapt California's electric grid to climate change, and the current state of the kind of climate change adaptation regulatory proceeding in California is effectively asking utilities to go out and craft their own vulnerability assessments, which kind of, as far as I can tell, focus maybe on, sea level rise substations and maybe starting to think about things like thermal overloads at some transformers and things like that. So if I can maybe follow up a little bit on Gabriel's question, I'm curious just like how, in terms of like making decisions about these systems, maybe not so much like, how the utility should do this, because that's kind of a different set of questions. But in terms of like thinking ahead to future planning, I would be curious to hear your thoughts on how we can start incorporating these impacts a little bit more holistically in ways that are maybe at least somewhat practical.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, the climate change debate forces you to consider things evolving over a very long time horizon, which is different from like, I'm sitting here today and there's a wildfire that is currently happening, right? And I don't know that I have a great answer. I think that in large part, you do need to consider individual threats on a case-by-case basis and look at that evolution, right? So I think we can look at the evolution of sea level rise and assess vulnerability to that. I think concurrently, you have to take those projections of sea level rise, combine them with projections of wildfire risk, combine them with projections of, where fault lines and earthquakes are, combine them with projections of load growth, right? I think it just, I think you used the right word, right? Like it has to be holistic. And I don't know, like I think a lot of studies consider a single threat at a time, right? Like I'm much more familiar with hurricanes and many other things, but so many people are planning for the long-term implications of changing hurricanes and like storm surge and sea level rise and all the things that go with that. But I don't think you can separate it when it comes to, you know, sorry, let me pause for a second. I started recently to see some work in resilient expansion planning. And I think this is like the way that we need to go forward. And again, a lot of what I've seen is pretty academic, where you're, you know, evaluating the ability of these models to do this planning, not so much focusing on making sure that the data going into these scenarios is good, because it's challenged, like it's challenging. So yeah, I mean, I think it needs to be interdisciplinary, and I think you need to get all the climate modelers and all of the utility planners and you know, I don't know, urban planners all together in a room and have them sort it all out. But yeah, I don't have a great answer for you on that one.
It's a hard question. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, and I'll have a follow-up on renewables, but first I would like to hand it over to Rodrigo, who has another question.
Yes, so it's related with, essentially, you mentioned that you can have sort of second order impacts, and there is this large range of grid impacts. And usually, I don't know if you have some sort of framework or modeling ideas on how to considering cascading issues. You combine different models. I don't know exactly. I know this is a really complicated problem in power system to sort of model cascading issues. So
yeah, I agree. So for something like production cost modeling, which is where I've been doing a lot of my simulations, I've been doing it just by pre-processing data to account for those second order impacts and using that as like the relevant time series. So it's not happening in real time on the fly. I don't have these physics-based models that are, you know, taking a time series of wind speed from a hurricane, for example. It's sort of all pre-processed, but I can do this because this is research, right? It's not the real world. We're just trying to model these scenarios. I think if you did get into a real world setting where you are trying to analyze a threat that is unfolding right now in real time, I think that's where you need to actually have like in the loop physics-based models. And it's complicated, right? It's complicated to model those second order impacts well. But for example, something that we are working on with this NARM project is, you know, closely coupling gas and electricity models, right? So in that case, in real time, if a pipeline bursts, the electric sector would, you know, see that and have resulting changes to their gas availability for any downstream generators. So it's possible, but again, it's like, it's quite challenging on a large scale.
Yeah, I know. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to come back to the topic of renewables and ask you how you respond to folks who inevitably argue that an electric grid with a high contribution from renewable resources is more vulnerable to climate effects. That some of that has come up, you know, in the context of some power outages in California during a heat wave recently. But I think there's broader, you know, ways that inevitably that will be argued. Does your work inform an answer to that question? Do renewables, would a very high penetration renewable electric grid be more vulnerable?
I don't think I am the expert to give you a definitive answer, but in the research that I have done, I would say no. So other than the extreme cold forcing wind turbines to shut down, you know, we've tried to find direct impacts for wind and solar from other threat types. And it seems like earthquakes, fine, like no problems, right? Like maybe a solar panel gets like knocked off its, I don't know, its stand or something, but typically, you know, they're not heavily impacted. I don't know. I think that my answer is probably the same answer as to like why we can survive a future with high renewables. And I think if you start to combine renewables with storage and demand response, and if you again use a holistic approach, that you have the same level of resilience, if not higher, than we have now. I just think of all of the things that can go wrong with fossil fuel-based generation, right? So there are some like massive supply issues, and any disruption to the supply chain is a type of resilience that I haven't even considered. And I probably should have, because I think in reading about this polar vortex at some point, I read a study that said like rivers freeze, and all of a sudden those barges that bring coal to these plants can't get there, right? And like I had never thought of that. I'd never considered that in my life. But considering the things that can go wrong with fuel supply, it doesn't seem that resilient to me.
So that's interesting, and I would maybe add to that considering situations where plant operators can't get to work, and how that could affect generation. I'm wondering if you how you think about scenarios that are not just sort of created by natural catastrophic events, but how your work, and I think that the NARM project also is interested in this, how you think about possible deliberate attacks and vulnerabilities to such attacks. And in particular, something that fascinates me in the context of how do you help train or prepare operators to respond to extreme situations. I'm interested in how they will even know what's happening. So I wonder if you can talk about the situational awareness component. When there's an earthquake, we all know what caused the problem. Situational awareness might be difficult if communication is down. There was a classic example in 1989 with the Loma Prieta earthquake in California, where some power plant operators kept their plant online absent any knowledge about what was happening in the rest of the world, just by monitoring their bus voltage and frequency. So that was a beautiful but maybe quaint example. What if there's a cyber attack and nobody knows what the hell just happened? Are these things that you can begin to address?
I think so. And the challenge with things like targeted attacks is that you can't rely on hundreds of years of historical weather data to teach you about what might go wrong. I think that these types of models, so NARM, for example, I think that it can be used to do a wide range of studies about what the early phases of a cyber attack might look like. And, even if there's a large degree of uncertainty, we can offer some heuristics, right? So the models might not be fast enough to respond in real time, but we can do all sorts of analysis up front to have some best practices to put in place, right? So like, maybe a cyber attack's not the best example, but if you're familiar with like a high altitude EMP, there are some folks out there that think, you can actually minimize damage if you just shut everything down, right? Like instead of having a months long blackout as you have to repair the entire grid, you just shut everything down for a couple of minutes and let the EMP finish, whatever the word is, and then sort of get everything back online. And so you maybe have, an hour-long outage for the entire country, but you reduce that damage and don't have to repair everything. I don't know what the right answer is, but I do think that these models can be used to try to assess like the range of impacts and what your decision-making space is once you start to see that like, we think we're going in this direction, the worst case is extremely bad, so it's okay to take drastic action. And yeah, to your earlier point, NARM is very interested in targeted attacks. So we are looking at physical attacks, at cyber attacks. I can't talk a ton about that space I'm also not an expert in that space, but a lot of it is just trying to figure out what the critical components are. And if you can identify those, maybe there are some ways you can protect them, and therefore the worst case impact becomes a lot less worse.
I think it's really interesting what you said about, the operator decision making, because, for instance, if we understand from an analytic perspective that a really drastic action is the right thing to do, that's still a very hard judgment call for an operator to make. And I'm thinking, for example, about the 2003 Northeastern blackout, where if only the First Energy operators had made the decision to shed Cleveland, everything would have been fine. But nobody wants to be the operator who comes home from work and says, "Hey, honey, I blacked out Cleveland today, and how was your day?" Right?
There's also no way, if you made the right call, there's no way to prove it, because the worst
Exactly.
case
So, how do we support operators? I mean, first of all, train them with all the data we can provide, and support them in that decision making. That's a tough one, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I don't know, like, maybe we just need a different incentive structure, right? Where it's not every company out for themselves, and we have more of a collaborative view on like protecting our nation's infrastructure and minimizing the impacts. I don't know if that's the right decision. I think in large parts, communication is the only way to go, right? So communicating about the fact that these models are validated, are trustworthy, and I'm not saying they're there yet, but hopefully eventually they will get to the point that they are heavily validated and heavily trustworthy by all of the utilities, all of the ISOs. And if we get to that point, then I think we can start to show results of these studies, right? We can do some like really in-depth analyses of these what if scenarios and show that like these drastic actions are the best thing to do, right? I think most people thought that shutting down the country in the face of COVID was extremely drastic, but maybe we should have done more, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that human element is always challenging, and I imagine in any bad situation, some higher up will end up getting fired if they do the wrong thing. And I don't have a great answer to that.
I have another question, unless somebody else wants to jump in. I don't have anything in the chat queue. Is there a raised hand?
There's a physical raised hand, yes.
Oh, go ahead, Julia, please.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm actually working on a research project that's linking a water resources model with a capacity expansion model to assess climate impacts in future planning decisions. So I'm really interested in this drought project that you mentioned. Could you talk more about what that project is and how you're thinking about modeling droughts, and what impact models are you looking at, and how to model extreme event impacts differently from these long-term new normal changes? Yes. That's a lot of questions in one.
I don't have a lot to say, because this is very new in terms of us starting to think about what it means to truly incorporate drought modeling. And the biggest challenge is, from a mathematical perspective, is accounting for those longer term constraints. So coupling these water basin models, and I'm very much not an expert in water, but I've talked to some folks, so I think I know some of the terminology, but coupling these water basin models with something like a production cost model for the electric grid. Typical production cost models use maybe like an hourly constraint. You can probably turn it easily into a daily constraint, but doing planning over a horizon of months or even years in the case of a drought is a mathematical challenge in terms of like tracking the data as you go. So we've started thinking quite a bit about how you actually do that. And we deal a lot in the world of decisions under uncertainty, right? So you have uncertain forecasts for this drought. You structured your constraints based on those. And then at every time period, as you get more information and hopefully a more accurate forecast, you can update that. But it's really just, you know, the complicated math of tracking the constraints across time periods. But yeah, I don't have a great answer since we haven't gotten too far into this.
So we have, oh,
I was just gonna say,
pardon me.
I'd be quite curious to hear about what you're doing in that space as well.
Well, there might be opportunities for follow-up. We have exactly 3 minutes left. There's one question in the queue and some personal questions we want to also ask. Philippe asked about physical loss of communication systems. Philippe, do you want to quickly reiterate that? But you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. Sorry. Yeah, I was curious about the physical loss of infrastructure, servers, fiber lines, stuff like that. Are you guys modeling the communication infrastructure along with the gas and the electric?
We are, yeah. So for NARM, we are modeling communication infrastructure. We have not yet incorporated it into our threat models. Again, because there's a lot less data and it's a lot less clear what those impacts will look like. So other than just making it up, we're trying to sort of take it slowly in terms of figuring out what the, you know, either the damage or the outages would look like in the communication space. And yeah, I think then there's a longer term question about what a loss of communication means for decision making if you don't have the data feeds that you were previously getting. And I also don't have a great answer to that.
Well, to wrap things up, Andrea, we'd like to know just a little bit more about how you came to be interested in the space, and then we need to know your favorite movie.
Okay. How I came to be interested in space. I think it really came out of you know, a desire to work on issues of sustainability, which initially led to renewables integration and then climate change and then grid impacts and resilience. So I realize I'm a little bit away from that, you know, renewable integration question when it comes to the work I'm doing now. But I do try to tell myself that it is still important and related, even if it's not, you know, the passion for sustainability that I came in with. And my favorite movie. So I was warned about this. I think my answer, even though I haven't seen this movie in a very long time, I think my answer is Gladiator. It's yeah, I just think it's an excellent movie. So I'll leave it at that.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm turning it over to Jose to close us out.
Well, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you, Andrea, for being the first event of our triple header on resiliency. I will send you invites to the rest of the talks just in case you want to join us for the rest. I think we have interesting, more people coming in, and everybody who stayed the whole presentation. I'm going to post the link for the raffle right now on the chat for everybody. Please complete it. And if you remember, if you come to the 3 presentations and get the 3 movies from the 3 presenters, you are you're part of, you can win an Amazon card for $20. And
Well, thank you all so much.
Sorry?
Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, I'm very glad. And thank you, Sasha, for being our faculty invited. We hope to have you again soon. And you'll also, I'll send you links for the remaining of our talks to join us. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.